Our speaker today is Alex S. Vitale. We are just so lucky to have him with us. His book, The End of Policing, has inspired many to rethink the whole concept of policing. He is a professor of sociology and coordinator of the Policing and Social Justice Project at Brooklyn College and a visiting professor at London's South Bank University. He has spent the last 30 years writing about policing. He consults with both police departments and human rights organizations internationally. His academic writings and essays are well known, and he's appeared on such networks as CNN, MSNBC, CNBC, NPR, PBS, Democracy Now!, and The Daily Show with Trevor Noah. We invited him today because the topic of policing, and especially the topic of defunding the police, is such a hot topic since the summer. While many people like Alex have been exploring that topic for many years, it is a new concept to many others. The American Ethical Union has not taken a position on defunding or abolishing police, so today is an exploration of the idea to expand our understanding. We have not been afraid to take controversial positions or study controversial issues in our commitment to the worth and dignity of every human person and to the value of human connection. So Alex, we're going to spotlight you here and look forward to more understanding on this hot topic.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to have a chance to join you all in fellowship this morning across the ethical culture societies. And I'm really happy that you're taking a deep look at what is such an important question that has to be at the center of any conversation about racial and economic justice in the United States. So, following the police killings of Mike Brown, of Eric Garner, of Tamir Rice, of so many others in the period 5-6 years ago, we were told, don't worry, we're going to fix policing. The Obama administration created a task force on 21st century policing that issued a broad set of recommendations designed to reform the police, to make them more professional, more transparent, more accountable, so that trust could be restored to American policing. Most of these reforms we often refer to as procedural justice-oriented reforms that rest on the idea that when the criminal justice system takes the time to explain what it's doing, hear everyone's side of the story, follow proper procedure, that people feel better about the outcome, even if they end up getting a ticket or being found guilty of something. The problem is that these reforms are not working, in part because they fundamentally misunderstand the nature of the problem we face. In Minneapolis, the officers responsible for the death of George Floyd had had implicit bias training, had de-escalation training, had mindfulness training, were wearing body cameras, were operating under a new use of force policy that highlighted the need to protect the sanctity of life. We're operating under a new policy that required that officers affirmatively intervene if they witness misconduct by a fellow officer, especially if it threatens the sanctity of life. They were operating under a new early warning system designed to identify potentially problematic officers so that they could get retraining or possibly discipline. And none of it made any difference. Minneapolis was held up as a shining star of the Obama-era reforms. They even issued this big glossy report in 2018 outlining how they had, adopted so many of these reforms. But American police continue to kill over 1,000 people a year. Racial disparities in arrests and use of force continue unabated. And we have got to figure out a different way to address this problem than imagining we can fix it with training and technology. So let's just look for a second at some of these reforms and why they can't possibly fix the problem. In the current House Democratic bill that is being championed as the path forward to police reform, one of the central features remains implicit bias training. This is incredibly popular. It's been implemented by many police departments in the US and internationally, and we have absolutely nothing to show for it. Implicit bias training rests on the idea that the problems of policing and race are unconscious, unintentional, and located in individual discretionary decision-making by specific officers. Well, first of all, we have a problem of explicit racism in American policing. When we look for it, we find it. Just last week, a very high-ranking NYPD officer who was in charge of human services, of handling complaints of racism and sexism within the police department, was suspended for making racist posts over a long period of years on police chat boards using a fake name. But an investigation uncovered his true identity, and he is supposed to be in charge of protecting the workplace rights of Black and female officers. We see this in other chat boards, Facebook pages. The official statements of police union leaders too often are explicitly racist. And the widespread backing of Trump by police associations and unions should further undermine our confidence that the problems of racially disparate policing are unconscious, unintentional, and can be fixed in a few hours of bias training. The NYPD was given this training following the police killing of Eric Garner. The city spent millions of dollars on this training, and its own research showed that it had absolutely no effect on officers. They ticked off little boxes saying, oh, they learned so much, but when they actually monitored their behavior, there was absolutely no measurable difference in their behavior. But it's also a mistake to think that the problems of race and policing can be reduced to just the racism of individual officers. Policing is becoming increasingly diverse, and there's really a problem of structural racism at work here. Structural racism in the history and nature of police departments that have always served as a locus for reproducing racial inequality, even when they follow proper procedure and the law. But there's an even deeper problem of structural racism, and that is the decision of elected officials to turn every social problem affecting poor and non-white communities over to the police to manage. Whiter, wealthier communities, their problems get managed in different ways. They have access to stable housing and stable employment and high quality health care and support services. And when one of their children gets caught with drugs in a fancy school, nobody's calling the police. Why? Because the parents don't want the police called. Why? Because they know nothing good can come out of that for their child. But in big urban public school systems, the police are routinely called when a young person is found with drugs, and their lives are made materially worse as a result of that decision. We have to get out of this idea that the only possible tool available to solve our community problems are embedded in the criminal legal system. And this is really the problem with community policing. it sounds good on the surface. You know, who doesn't want the police to know who's in the community, to have a sense of who the good people are and who the bad people are, and to work with the community to identify strategies to solve their community problems? First of all, the community that the police are in dialogue with is never really representative of the entire community. It's always a certain subset of the community that is looking for police-oriented solutions to their problems. But the whole concept of turning social problems over to the police to manage is the real problem. Because what tools do the police have to solve our community problems? Guns, handcuffs, ticket books, tear gas. These aren't the tools that we need to solve our community problems. Do they have access to stable housing, jobs for our young people, high quality mental health and social services, counselors in our schools? No, they don't have any of those things. And part of the problem we're facing is that for the last 40 or 50 years, communities have been told the only resource they can have to address their problems is policing. And then when police act improperly or even properly, but in a way that reinforces existing inequalities of race and class, we're told from elected officials, don't worry, we're going to fix this with some training. We're not going to do anything to solve mass homelessness. We're not going to do anything to really address the damage that's caused by substance abuse. We're not going to do anything about failed schools. We're going to paper over and manage those problems with mass policing in a way that unavoidably is more intensively present in the already most vulnerable communities in our society. So how do we get into this mess? Well, there's a long version of this story, and then there's a shorter version. The longer version is that really our elected officials at so many levels in both parties have succumbed to a kind of neoliberal austerity as unavoidable. Under the pressure of global competition, which they themselves helped create, these political leaders have decided that all they can do is attempt to subsidize the already most successful parts of the economy, to push wealth up the economic ladder through tax breaks and subsidies, in hopes that some of that wealth that's created will magically trickle down to the rest of us. But that trickle down has not materialized. The wealthy have become unbelievably rich and unaccountable. And instead of raising up the rest of us, it's produced mass homelessness, mass untreated mental health and substance abuse problems, failed schools, mass participation in black markets of drugs and sex work and stolen goods. And then, rather than acknowledging the failures of those systems to produce a decent, stable, safe life for people, it has turned the police loose on them. Part of this is a misunderstanding of the nature of policing. They believe that the police exist to enforce the law and that the law exists to make everyone's life better. That if we could just get the police to properly enforce the law, that this would automatically benefit everyone equally. Well, the police don't actually spend that much time enforcing the law. The law is a kind of guidepost. Police enforce order. But even when they are enforcing the law, that law does not automatically benefit everyone equally. There's a famous 19th century saying, "The law in its majesty forbids both the rich and the poor from sleeping under bridges, stealing bread, and begging in the streets." But of course, the rich don't need to do these things. That legal system was designed to reinforce and protect existing inequalities. And we can see that more clearly today in something like the war on drugs. The modern war on drugs, created about 50 years ago at the Nixon administration, never had anything to do with public health or public safety. It was about a rancid politics of racism in which Republicans attempted to appeal to historically democratic white Southern voters in the South in the wake of the victories of the Civil Rights Movement. They tried to appeal to those white voters by saying, you know, we can't bring back formal segregation and Jim Crow, but we can still put blacks into a second-class status by creating a war on drugs and a war on crime. And since the states had typically been in charge of law enforcement historically, they needed a way to get into that business at the federal level, and they chose drugs because drugs often cross state lines and international boundaries. Nixon's own White House officials have come forward in recent decades and said that this is what happened, that their own public health officials were for legalization and harm reduction strategies, but that the war on drugs was created to demonize their political enemies for racist-oriented political gains. And it worked so well, it's been embraced by both parties, who continue to govern through criminalization of the already most vulnerable populations in our society. But there's a larger truth about policing that's also overlooked. Policing is a fairly modern invention. Most police departments have been around less than 200 years. We think, oh, the police exist to enforce the law, to keep us safe, as an alternative to the use of military troops. But the reality is that police institutions, created mostly in the late 18th and early 19th century, were created specifically to facilitate regimes of profound exploitation. During that period, those regimes of exploitation revolved around colonialism, slavery, and mass industrialization. I argue the very first police force in the United States was the Charleston City Watch and Guard, created in the late 1780s. They were professional, uniformed, 24-hour law enforcement-oriented officers, but the law that they were enforcing was the law of slavery. In Charleston and other big cities of the South, slaves actually worked outside the home of their owners. Very different than the plantation system that we normally think of. Each morning, slaves would wake up and travel on public streets to wharves, warehouses, and workshops where they earned wages that were returned to their owners. In Charleston, there were more black slaves traveling to work each day than there were whites. And this was a source of extreme concern for the white population. Fear of slave revolts and uprisings, of the formation of underground societies, reading groups, religious associations, meant that they needed to create a force capable of managing and overseeing this mobile slave population. So they created the Charleston City Watch and Guard. They issued slaves metal badges, ironically, that identified their owner and their identity so that police could micromanage their behaviors, oversee them, commit acts of violence against them. We had our own form of colonial policing in the United States. Western police departments like the Texas Rangers were created to facilitate the extermination of and removal of indigenous populations, the forced removal of historically Mexican landholders, all to make way for white settlement. In Texas, up until the late 1960s and early 70s, the Texas Rangers enforced a system of Juan Crow, very similar to the system of Jim Crow in the South. Latinos were denied the right to vote, to form unions, to use public facilities on an equal basis. And if Latinos tried to vote or organize a union, the Texas Rangers would be called in to suppress their movements through violence and intimidation. The very first state police force in the United States was the Pennsylvania State Police, created in 1905. They were designed to manage the uprisings of steel and iron workers. Private police forces had been used, resulting in numerous massacres, and the local police couldn't be counted on to suppress these movements. So they needed a state police force that was independent of local control, that could act on behest of the owners to suppress unionization. The model for this new state police force was the U.S. occupation forces in the Philippines, who at the end of the Spanish-American War oversaw a massive American colonial project in the Philippine countryside. The Pennsylvania state government imported individuals, technology, and tactics direct from the Philippines to create this new force that was so ruthless that workers in Pennsylvania referred to them as the Pennsylvania Cossacks. If we don't want violence and racism to be the tools used to manage our social problems, we should do everything we possibly can to keep the police out of it. And to quit pretending that we can fix this problem with a handful of superficial and ineffective reforms. Body cameras, throwing a few police officers in jail has not worked. It has not brought the relief that people hoped, in part because it does nothing to address the fundamental flaw in deciding to turn all of our social problems over to police, who only have tools of coercion and violence. Our communities, many of them, face very severe problems: violence, mass homelessness, untreated mental health problems. If we want to save lives, we need to quit putting more resources into policing and try to develop alternative resources that could directly address the public safety challenges that communities face without relying on these tools of coercion and violence. Between 1.25% of all people killed by police in the United States are having a mental health crisis. We have systematically defunded public mental health services in the United States. The savings that was reaped from the closing of deeply problematic state hospital systems did not go into community-based support systems. It went into tax breaks to the rich and building more prisons. And as a result, when a family member is in crisis and their parent calls for help, they get an armed police response, like we saw in Philadelphia a few weeks ago. And those officers who spend the vast majority of their time engaged in a process of threat neutralization are never going to get enough training to get them to completely change the way they do things, which is what's needed. The good news is that a growing number of communities across the country are shifting gears, are seeing the harms that are being caused by turning everything over to the police to manage. A number of cities have recently voted to get police out of schools in Portland, Maine, and Oakland, California, and Minneapolis. An even larger group of cities are getting police out of the mental health crisis response business in Denver and Portland, Oregon, in Austin, in Albuquerque, in Los Angeles. And just recently, the mayor in New York announced a pilot program for our city. This is the kind of police reform that's going to save lives. that's going to build up stronger and healthier communities and point to a different path for justice. We've come to accept this idea that justice is measured in years of incarceration, in intensity of punishment. We've got to instead change that conversation to talk about how justice is about building stronger, healthier, more resilient communities. It's about building people up, not tearing them down. And I think those are principles that will resonate very strongly with today's listeners. So I'm going to stop here, and I'll be very happy to take what I'm sure will be a large number of questions about this important topic. Thank you.